Our guest on this episode of the podcast is Gavin Evans. He is the author of the book, Son of a Preacher Man. In this extraordinary memoir, he tries to piece together the world of his father, Bishop Bruce Evans, the disintegration of their relationship, and the journey to love and healing just before the bishop's death. My name is Nongcebo McKenzie. Ngiyakwamukela. Welcome to the podcast. Our guest on this episode of the podcast is Gavin Evans. Gavin is the author of the book, Son of a Preacher Man, one of 11 books. Am I correct, Gavin? You've written 10 books and this is your 11th book. Yeah. I'm always amazed. I wouldn't know where to start if I were to write a book, and you've written them on different topics. I wouldn't know where to start. And I always ask myself, how do you know when you've finished? How do you get to a point where I've expressed every thought and every feeling about this topic and I am now done?
With a book like this, you never really finished until the book is published because, just the process of writing is one where if you think you've done, then you just from experience, you've got a long, long way to go because this belongs there and that belongs here, and you haven't said this and this doesn't feel real, and so there's a lot of to and from, and you have people like your best readers. So I sent bits of that to members of my family because that I needed to do that. But also to my wife, Margie Alford. I sent her bits. What do you think of this? And she would make suggestions, and they'd make suggestions. And then, of course, one has an editor. So it's a long answer to a good question, but I don't really know the answer to that except that when you get the draft copy of your book and then you think, oh my God, I should have said that to the next thing. Yeah.
I found a piece from your book quite interesting in the context of, one, your upbringing, but also the title of your book, Son of a Preacher Man. That's page 207. All of this was part of the realm of the supernatural that I had once accepted without question. It proved harder to cast off than the idea that the Bible was the Word of God, or that God created the heavens and the earth, or that we went to heaven or hell after dying. Quite simply, I had grown up believing in miracles, believing in magic, really, and this was hard to drop. But when I thought about this, about miracles, divine healing, premonitions, about death and illness, and the like, I came to realize that there were always more rational explanations than those involving the supernatural or special powers. And I found that intriguing because a lot of people who have grown up in whatever faith, obviously your father was an Anglican bishop, but a lot of people who grew up under whichever denomination, they tend to carry threads of that through their life, especially yourself. You were involved with youth groups, Scripture Union, and all of that. And I always find it interesting that, and I read this somewhere once where a person was talking about, they'd written about the importance of introducing some level of faith-based belief system in your children. And they said, give your children something to believe in so that when they face the hardships of the world, they've got something to come back to and lean on. And so you'll find people really carrying threads of that through into their lives. And they'll come back to that in hardship and joy, in precious moments. But on your end, that's something that you have opted to not identify with. I was curious about that.
Yeah, and it took quite a while. I separated myself, I suppose, when we were putting it, from Christianity when I was 17. I describe it in the book. I was on an airplane on the way to Texas to be an exchange student, and I sort of I'd broken with my father in a way at that point, and then I broke with my idea of God. But for a long time, I was really an agnostic. What I would say to myself and to people who are close to me was that I really don't know. And so I don't have a positive belief in God, but I don't have a disbelief in God either. But gradually as I went on, and the more I read and I immersed myself, really from the 2000s onwards, in science, and initially mainly biology, but I also started thinking of the cosmos and so on, and the idea that there was a God or gods, mm-hmm. or a realm that was different from the physical, emotional realm, spiritual in the emotional sense rather than in the cosmos sense. It just seemed more and more ridiculous to me. Mm-hmm. And so eventually I got to the point where I thought, well, I'm actually really not an agnostic. I positively don't believe in God or gods or spirits or anything else. I just believe that we are animals, and when we die, and that's the end of us. And I'm in one sense, I had a very, very strong sense of that, mm-hmm. when my father died and I saw his body. For a lot of people, they hope that they'll be able to see their loved one again. But when I saw his body, I realized that there's nothing else there. That's it. It's over. And so part of that was coming to terms with the idea that there is no life after death, that we die and that's the end of us. And I started to think of it as a kind of general anesthetic, which I've had 4 operations under general anesthetic, and you know nothing of what happened there. And then I started thinking of, well, before I was born, I didn't exist. Why should I exist afterwards? And I've got my peace with that. It doesn't now. It doesn't worry me anymore that I will cease to exist, except in the memories of other people when I die. But it, as I said, it did take me a long time to get to that point. And part of it was what you said, was that background that I had, and that kind of core belief that I had from year dot, from when I was born almost, was inculcated into me. And so it took a long time to be able to kind of shake that off.
And you put it so succinctly, you separated from Christianity, because, you know, when you say that, the imagery that comes to mind is that you were joined to the faith in practice, in your entire upbringing. You were the son of a preacher man. You are the son of a preacher man.
Yeah, that's very true. Though in the kind of Christianity I was brought up, which was evangelical Christianity, you still required to have that moment of personal faith, that moment of being born again, as they put it, of asking Jesus to be your personal savior. And that happened when I was 8 years old. So yes, I was raised in it, and but I did have that moment where I believed that I was now, born again.
Yeah. And so when you say you separated from it, it's like, as I say, the imagery is sort of like Velcro. When you separate Velcro, that's what comes to mind.
That's a very good analogy.
Yeah, because as I say, it's different from somebody who has some big moment of realization. And of course, as you explain, you did go through that, but it's different for somebody who's maybe been on the wayward path for whatever reason, and then at 25 or at 30 or at 40, they then say, oh, you know what, I've discovered God, I interpret it differently. And I'm curious, though, as to the relation between that and your relationship with your father.
So the two are in a way bound up together, and I describe in different scenarios, different kind of anecdotes about my relationship with my father, which was a very loving relationship, but was fraught, and certainly when a teenager, those kinds of conflicts often come to the fore, and there was a moment which I described when in the book when I was 14, where he kind of beat me up, and that sort of created a fissure between us. But to break from, I needed some separation physically, and so it was in an airplane on the way to Texas where I made that decision to break from God. And once I'd made that decision, then all sorts of questions that had been lurking under the surface started popping up.
So the moment at 14, and it wasn't the only incident, the moment when your father beat you up. There are people who grow up in homes where corporal punishment is the norm, and for them it's not something that would ever create a rift between them and their parents. And there are people who grow up in such environments and, like you, make the decision to never lay a hand on their children. There are people who grow up in homes where there's discipline and it's strict, not over the top strict, but it's strict. There are rules, and they decide on a different way of parenting. We all experience our parents differently, and we all interpret how they choose to discipline us in our own way. It's a very subjective experience. So I'm curious as to why, for you, that was something that drove a wedge between yourself and your father.
Okay, I think you've put it very well there, because, for example, I was regularly beaten at school, particularly when I was at junior school. I was at Awash junior school, and they used to beat us relentlessly and ruthlessly. So I was not unaccustomed to being beaten, but it was from my father. And my father had been the loving one, the warm one in the family for all sorts of reasons. My mother was more distant, and I had a more distant relationship with her. My relationship with her actually really only developed after my father died. But with my father, there was this kind of trust, and he had never hit us. My mother used to slap us and shake us fairly often, but my father had never done that. So there was a sense that my father was the loving, warm one, and that was broken when, and to me at 14, it was a kind of a breaking of trust, because he had done something that to me was wrong, and he had done it to me, and I didn't understand it. I didn't know what I'd done wrong, but I didn't think that could ever be justified. So it was a profound experience for me, which when for other people it might not have been an experience that was significant at all.
I think I understand. You described the shaking, and I think the incident where your father punched you in the book. Obviously, in the book, things are written in a linear fashion, but we obviously don't live life in a linear fashion. So there was a sort of like a parallel drawn between how your mother used to shake, and I think on the occasion that you made an example of was when she shook Michael, your older brother.
Yeah.
And then we continue in the book to the part where your father, as you describe it, punched you for whatever transgression had transpired at the time. And so I think I understand what you're saying, that when your source of comfort, when your source of love, you describe from birth, from infancy, the difficulty in attaching with your mother because of your sphincter, and not being able to feed, and not being able to spend sort of that time with your mother, and the endless crying and all of that. So it makes sense how you describe it, because that was a question for me where I was like, I wonder why it was so significant, and so significant that it would sort of drive this wedge for you that took such a long time to repair, but also you do a lot of justice to him in the book by making reference to a lot of the times where he did express that he loves you, where he did show up. I mean, he came to Texas and, he slept on that little sofa, it's all those little things where I was like, oh, okay, I wonder why this moment was so significant that it overshadowed all his other attempts.
Yeah, the two coexisted, and you're right. I mean, he always had our backs, and I mean, particularly in our kind of anti-apartheid activities, he was always there for us. I mean, the one incident I give, which I didn't discover the fully what he had done, all he has done, was when the security police, when I was staying in Port Elizabeth, the security police came to our house. They realized that I hadn't gone to the army.
Yes.
I'd just been, because the white boys had conscription, and I'd had jaundice at the time. It was we had to fill in the form, so I didn't do that. So I'd managed to kind of sneak out of it. And then the security police came and they said, look, unless you cooperate with us, we're going to make sure that the military police come and get you at work. And I said, get out of my house. And then the military police came to my work, and my father kind of sprung into action, and he wrote to the minister, and he wrote to this one and that one, and managed to get me a 6-month deferment, by which stage I then registered for a course I could get out of the army by just carrying on studying. I accumulated all these degrees as a result of that. But it was his. I mean, he played a big role there. And I mean, he wrote to the army and he said, we never had guns in our house, and we never even let the children play with guns, which wasn't true at all. We used to play with guns. I used to shoot everybody and play with guns and all sorts of things. But he went he went all the way to do his utmost. And that wasn't just a one-off thing. That's just one example. Yeah.
I find it interesting that in the book you refer to your parents by name, Joan and Bruce.
I mean, nowadays, okay, my mother's very old and she has dementia, but I still call her Joan because I think as adults, once one gets to know them, I wanted to get to know them not just as my parents, but as adults that I could relate to, like I would any other adult, except it's an exceptional relationship because they're my parents, and so I would call them Joan and Bruce, and they like that. It was a sense of intimacy in a way, being able to call them by their first name rather than this kind of honorific title.
It's quite interesting. And this is the beauty of engaging in conversation with people and getting their perspectives, because it's easy to interpret that as disrespect. It's easy to interpret that as disregard. It's easy to interpret that as a continuation of your desire to disassociate from them. Whereas for you, it's actually getting to know your parents as people. And it's not until much later in life that we meet our parents as the people that they are, but we've experienced them as the people that they were. Because your mother at 35 is not your mother at 23. Your mother at 65 is not your mother at 40. And so you've got all these feelings and opinions and resentments and treasured moments and, this myriad of experiences and feelings that you've carried on into your life, into your parenting journey, into your other relationships, into your friendships, into your perception of the world. And then at some point you meet them as who they are right now, but you've formed an opinion and shaped your life based on your experience of who they were when you were growing up. So you are meeting them through a version of their lens, But you can't go back to that. You can't, because if you, and this is just, the easiest example, if you are still experiencing and feeling some resentment based on an incident when your father was 14, and again when 17, and those are the incidents that I'm focusing on because those were deeply articulated in the book. By the time you meet your father as Bruce, those have happened. And you've rationalized them, you've felt angry about them, you've either forgiven or not forgiven, you've got some residual feeling about that, but you can't go back into who Bruce was when you were 14 and how he was experiencing being the father of a 14-year-old, and, the whole perception of how a bishop would conduct himself, of how a white man would conduct himself in apartheid South Africa, of how a Jewish Anglican bishop would conduct himself. And you then meet him with all of that caught up in the ecosystem of your relationship. But you're beyond that now. It's amazing to me.
In a way, my relationship with my father was much more fraught than with my mother, because it had been in a more overtly loving relationship, and so there was more emotion involved in it. But the one incident in the book that I do describe was not long after my first daughter was born, and we went to stay with them on a holiday for a few days, and we kind of got talking, and I can't remember how it came up, but there was an incident when I was 17 where we kind of went nose to nose, and he said. And he had walked away, and I said it was a good thing that you walked away, because I said I would have fought back. And when he said, well, you wouldn't have had a chance, and then he realized what he had said, and I said to him, I reminded him of what happened when I was 14, and he remembered it, of course, and my mother remembered it, and they were there, and I said, you did that, and I said to my mother, and you just stood by, you didn't, and she said, well. Basically, that we grew up with this idea that you must always stand by your man, and he thought about it, and then the next day we had to go, so we were going back. We were due to go back, but he wrote to me, and he said he'd spent the whole night up, and he realized what he had done, and he apologized. And I wrote back to say that I fully accepted his apology and that I loved him, and that meant that our relationship started to, that little fissure in the relationship. There was so much that was good in it already, but that thing could close in a way. And it wasn't very long after that he was diagnosed with motor neuron disease. And within a year after that, after the diagnosis, he died. So, I wish we had done that earlier, but at least there was the reconciliation over that. With my mother. It was that much less fraught. It was just that after my father died, she came into her own, like so many wives from that era. It happened. I don't think she's the only one. And she discovered her own abilities. When she was young, she was into woodwork, and she was a sports person, and she went to teach in Soweto in the in the early 1950s, which nobody had, and she did all sorts of things. But for a long time, she was just the minister's wife, and later the bishop's wife. And I think that there must have been a lot of subliminal frustration in her, and it just came out when my father died. She started. She got hugely into gardening competitions. She went to Khayelitsha and started helping an AIDS orphanage, and then also teaching the nursery school teachers, because she'd been a nursery school teacher. So she would go out there. For at least a full day every week. She wrote a kind of self-published memoir. She made speeches. She told jokes. She and I engaged. We'd sometimes argue, but we'd get on. We'd it was a real relationship that developed, and but it, I accepted like she was who she was and who she'd been, and I had some understanding of why she had been that way, but it was like creating a new relationship, really, with this person, and that was a really good thing. I mean, it was something that I think both of us relished.
I love how when she gave you the gift of one of the 3 stools, and then she took it back, and then she said, "No, Gavin won't mind. He and I get each other like that." And I thought that was so sweet.
It was very funny and very sweet. I mean, she was really in the early stages of dementia then, but not very advanced. And she said, "I want to give you a gift, because you live in London and I can never give you anything." So she said, "I've got these 3 lovely rimpy stools." And she said, "I want you to have one of them." Now, I mean, actually flying with a rimpy stool is not the easiest thing, but of course it was a gift. So I said, "That's wonderful, and thank you." And then I think the next night we all went out for dinner, and she said, "No, she wants it back." So my niece said, "You can't, Joan. You can't." She said, "You can't take a you can't take a gift back." She said, and as you say, she said, "No. It's missing that one's missing its friends, and they're missing it." So she said, "No, Gavin will understand. He and I get each other. He'll understand." So, and I said, "Yes, I do understand. That's fine," and I laughed. I didn't mind at all. Yeah.
I think for me, what really landed is sometimes we perceive some relationships to be easier. As you say, the relationship with your mother, and I'm saying easier in parenthesis, was easier because there wasn't as much of the emotional intertwinement. Whereas with your father, I wish more people would hear that. Let me put it that way. Because sometimes we think a relationship is difficult because we do not understand each other, especially in a parenting relationship. I can't imagine what it must be like raising 3 children, 2 of them boys, in that era. I can't even begin to imagine. And we face completely different circumstances now in our country, throughout the world. I mean, we're facing different challenges, and our children are exposed to different things. And we sort of attribute any friction in relationships to growing pains, to whatever the case might be. And I think what's really landed is that sometimes the relationship is difficult because of the emotional intertwinement between you and your child, because of how they perceived you in terms of, as you say, their soft landing spot or their main source of love, or the parent that understands them, the parent that's always there. And I suppose we never really know the moment when we break our children's trust. I suppose we never really know them as this is what is important for their heart to feel nurtured. Of course, we know as parents what, my child loves hugs, my child loves banana pudding, like your mom knew you loved banana pudding and you loved cottage pie. Of course we know, and of course we know what hurts them. Of course we know those things, but they're also coming into their own, and they're also learning what's important to them in the world. As you're saying, for you, being physically struck was something that was fundamentally wrong. And that is what for you was that break in the trust between you and your father. And I think that's what landed. Because in parenting relationships, and I suppose this would go for other relationships, there are these micro tears that we create in relationship simply because we maybe do not understand the depth of the connection, and how that micro tear actually then becomes a full-blown wound. And sometimes the relationship that we perceive as easier is easier because there isn't that much emotion there. And it's easier not because you get along more, not because the other person is easier. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. Not because of any other reason, but because that person occupies a less dense part of your heart. And I think that for me really landed from this discussion that we're having now, and really understanding, because that was a question for me. I was like, Why did this change the dynamic of your relationship so much? And I love how you then reflect on your own relationship with your daughters. And this is beautiful. I felt bound to my children far more than I was to their mother or to my career. I wove my work and life around the needs and wants of my daughters, writing, broadcasting, and editing on a freelance basis while my wife worked as a sub-editor at The Guardian. What it meant was that my self-definition was less as writer, academic, lecturer, husband, and more as a father, parent, carer. My career certainly suffered, but I felt I was doing the right thing. I'm sure there are many men who would identify with that, but haven't had the opportunity to try and explore that as much as you have. But I'm also sure that there are men who would be scared to even admit that I love you, you're my wife, you're great, you're wonderful, but it's the kids, man. It's the kids. I found it such a tender thing to reveal about yourself.
I mean, it was, and in a way, I wanted to. Part of it, I guess, in retrospect, was I'd been deeply involved in Christianity, and I've broken at that. I had been deeply involved in the struggle and in Marxism and in the ANC and the Communist Party and all these things, and I'd become cynical about it. I'd lost that faith as well, and so it came at a time when Tessa, my first child, was born in 1990, where I could devote myself to this, and this is what I wanted to be. I had all these big job offers, and I didn't want any of them. This is what I wanted to do, and I saw it as a kind of my mission in life. I mean, it sounds quite odd. Now I've got a grandchild, and my relationship with him is very easy and very easy and comfortable and lovely. And by the way, he also calls me Gavin. I said no, I can't. My daughter said, "Do you want them to call you granddad or grandpa or opa?" I said, no. I mean, everybody calls me Gavin, so he can call me Gavin as well, and that works. I much prefer that. So yeah. I'm sorry, it's a long answer to your question.
It's the light and shade of the experience. So the long answers are very welcome. But what I found interesting about what you've just said, everybody calls me Gavin, so he can call me Gavin. Whereas at some point you were Hoppy, at some point you were Johnny. So coming into Gavin was quite a journey in itself. And look now, your grandchild calls you by first name, which a lot of people would be like, but again, for you, it's that intimacy.
Yes. He could call me anything he wanted, and because when I was little, I kept on trying to change my name. I have great sympathy for anybody else who wants to change their name, and so many people do nowadays. And I never I look at that in a way of, okay, that's great, that's what they want to be, because that's how I was. But yeah, it's obviously a different relationship with your children and a grandchild. But the relationship with a grandchild is also a lovely one, or can be.
I find it interesting what you've just said about how you immersed yourself in your role as a father and why that was so significant to you, but contrasting that against the backdrop of your disenchantment with your other experiences, with the other aspects of your life. And you were obviously involved in the political struggle, and you left that life because of some observations that you made that were against what you believe in and what you stand for. But I cannot even begin to imagine what it must be like, firstly, living in apartheid South Africa. I cannot imagine what it must be like sitting at the same table as people that we read about in history books now that have got monuments built in their name. There are statues of them all over the world, all over the country. Streets are named after them, and these are people that you sat with. But I also can't imagine living in a world where you have to watch every single word, because how many times did you discover that somebody in your immediate surroundings, in your immediate, 1, 2, 3 degrees of separation was a spa?
Oh, that, yeah. I mean, in organizations that you're involved with, you just knew that there were going to be spies, and and sometimes you found them through they made mistakes, and then you had to work out how to deal with it. But you would also, the other thing on that is that people you knew well, and then you would find them making a kind of unconsciously racist remark, which they weren't even aware of what they were doing. And of course, that happens everywhere. But in South Africa at that stage, it was just more overt. And I guess in many ways, and this was the result of my father, and I do bring this into the book. Michael and Kari and I had a different upbringing, because he was always against apartheid, and but also within the church we regularly had black clergy staying in our house, which wasn't kind of the done thing at that stage. And then later, as a bishop, we had lots of kind of political people coming to to stay with us. So I was exposed to things that I guess most white South Africans at that stage were not exposed to. And partly as a result of that, I became much more sensitive to kind of, I found any expression of racism, even subliminally, quite abhorrent. And it's my other books I've written, a lot of them have been on the subject of race and racism and so on. So, but that, I think my father there, his influence was huge.
Mm-hmm. So reflecting on that, and reflecting on your experience, and reflecting on, I wouldn't say how far we've come, but I would say if we contrast the two worlds, because you had the benefit of experiencing the world in a less whitewashed way, if I can put it that way, because obviously there were messages that were out in the media. There were, what people now refer to as the good old days was heavily sanitized. And it was heavily restricted, and it was heavily regulated, and it was heavily planned to be a certain way and to look and feel a certain way. And you obviously had the experience, as you say, from your immediate environment, in your home, through your father, the exposure to that world, but then also how you, without hesitation, when you were asked, would you like to join the ANC? And you said, oh, yeah, sure, by all means. And you then obviously had that experience. And I sometimes get the sense that your generation and people that, were involved had a cause for South Africa, had a reason, whether they were on the other side, because some people wanted to keep it that way, but they had a cause. Was their cause right or wrong? History has told that story many times, but they had a cause. This was their South Africa that they wanted to keep a certain way. And on the other hand, people like yourself, your father, the people that you were involved in the struggle, you also had a cause for a different South Africa. And I often ask myself, the things that we look at now and we say, and we lament certain things. And I often wonder, is it because we maybe don't have a cause?
I think that we grew up in a way it was it was something apartheid was something absolutely terrible. And so if one had a conscience of any, one had to, one felt one just had to be involved in ending it, and one only needed to have a glimpse of how awful it was for the majority of people, and to feel like you had a duty to get involved. I mean, I think it's why. I mean, I know a lot of people in South Africa who instinctively recognize what is happening in Israel and Gaza as an apartheid situation, and they recognize apartheid when they see it. And many of them, they're my friends, are Jewish people, but they recognize that what is happening in Israel and in its occupation of the West Bank and Gaza as something akin to apartheid, and they feel motivated to oppose it because they recognize it's part of that collective memory, and they recognize that when they see it. So I mean, I think for many people, what is happening there has become a kind of a cause that they feel they again must be obliged to, in one way or another, say something about, at least. And I mean, for many other people, it's what's happening to the climate that they're throwing themselves into. But it's much more difficult because the climate, the weather, and what is producing that is a much more less definable enemy than the apartheid regime.
When you look now at, and this is weird with life, because we fight battles that maybe we didn't need to fight, but in the moment we feel we need to fight them. And sometimes in retrospect, we look back and we're like, really, I shouldn't have spent my time and energy. Had I known what I know now, I would not have done X, Y, Z. And when you look back, and you say this in the book also, that, you needed to go back and verify the accuracy of some memories. And I found that very interesting, because we tend to hold on to our memories. We tend to believe that our version of an incident is the version that exists. We might welcome another opinion, but we might not want to verify. Because even if they saw it that way, even if they recalled it that way, that's fine. They can view it that way and recall it that way, but this is how I recall it. And I found it quite interesting that you went back to your brother and sister just to sort of do a fact check and a reference check on your memories and how you'd articulated some things. When you look back now at your life, at your journey, your parenting journey, your journey with your parents, your political journey, your academic journey, all of it, is there anything that you would have done differently?
Oh gosh, yeah. I mean, there's a huge amount I would have done differently. I think that I would have still been involved if I had retrospective knowledge, which of course one never does. But I would still think if it was today and I was in the situation there, I would still have got involved in anti-apartheid activities in one way, in one way or another, because I think that one couldn't not. If one had a conscience, but yeah, the things in my relationship with my parents, and the things in my relationship with my children, the things that I've done in relationship with life, which I wish I hadn't done. I mean, it can't be otherwise, and I think that one has to just not spend too much time living in regret, living retrospectively. One has to try and live in the present, and to kind of relish that present, and to do as much as you can in the present, rather than drag this heavy weight of regret behind you.
Yes.
yeah. So, and it's a difficult balance, I think, sometimes to keep.
What I found interesting also in the book is how you tend to reach out. That was the perception that I got from the book. And regardless of whatever rejection that you might or might not face, you come across as somebody who will reach out. And I must say I was quite hurt when I read the part about how you tried reaching out, writing letters. And that's another thing that just, blows your mind when you read books that reflect on times back then, if I can use that term. The writing of letters and the waiting for the letter to be delivered. I mean, we WhatsApp people, we send them an email. So it's always, because the intimacy in writing a letter, you make a mistake, you typex it out, or you decide, this is not the letter. You don't just press the delete button, you start all over again. And you would reach out in letters and you would reach out to people. And one of the people that you repeatedly reached out to was the young lecturer that you were with in the car when you were supposed to be traveling to Botswana, but you were not supposed to be traveling to Botswana, but you didn't know that you were no longer supposed to be traveling to Botswana, so you landed up on this trip that obviously did not end well, and how you kept trying to reach out to him. And obviously, after some time, there were no longer any responses. Were you ever able to reconnect with him?
No, I wasn't. I did try and phone as well, but I completely understand that. When you've been involved in an accident like that and it's affected you so profoundly, you don't want to go back there. And what I recognized was in writing those letters, and that was for me, in a way. I mean, it was that if that person didn't need and didn't want to engage in that, of course that was completely up to him. And after a while, I realized, okay, if I carry on writing letters, it's almost like harassment, and I can't do that. So yeah, I mean, and obviously when you asked me about regret, it was one of the things I thought about was I wouldn't have gone on that trip. But and I mean the other letter writing thing, which it must be strange to digital natives, as they call people who grew up with social media, was with my father. There were letters. The letter where he wrote to me to say he was sorry and asked for forgiveness. The letter I wrote back saying I accepted his apology, and then just before he died, I wrote to him again, and I expressed my love for him. But very sadly, that letter arrived 2 days after he died, because of course international letters take a week then took about a week to arrive. Nowadays they take months if they do arrive. But so the letters. It is a very different kind of way of communication than sending a WhatsApp message. You would think about what you wrote. You would maybe rewrite it. It was a process that took time. I'm not saying it was better or worse. It was just different.
Speaking of the letter that came, 2 days too late, the delivery, it's amazing how some things, they seem to happen by chance, but their timing is almost otherworldly, because the delivery of the CDs that your father had asked for came with the postman when you were planning his funeral. And I thought to myself, oh, my goodness me. The pain of that, but also the timing for me, it seemed almost poetic, if I can say that, because there was this gift that he had specifically asked you for and that you had sent, and then you'd gotten the phone call and you had booked, and just after booking you then get the phone call that he is no more, and all he had wanted was to see his son Gavin, and he had wanted these CDs, and there is Gavin and there are the CDs, but your father is no more. But it all still arrived before he was put in the ground, before, you know, the funeral. Sorry, he wasn't buried, he was cremated, before before the ceremony of his transition had been performed, if I could put it that way. And I just found isn't it amazing that things land up where they're supposed to land up, in the manner that they're supposed to land up?
Yes, it is. Although I always wished that it had arrived a few days earlier, so that he could at least see it, and not the CDs. That perhaps was less of a thing, but the letter. When I told him I loved him, but you know, the death you can never predict. You can never say, okay, there's time to do this, that, or the next thing, because death doesn't take account of your best laid plans, and in this case, it certainly didn't.
Gavin, as we end our conversation, I think the book is entitled "Son of a Preacher Man," and it's about your journey and your experience, all tied up in that context of yourself being the son of a preacher man. And you obviously touch on your experiences with your siblings and with your mother and all the different aspects of your life. In the context of all of that, you know, people walk around carrying those things, and another person would say, oh, because I'm the son or the daughter of a man of the cloth or a woman of the cloth, there is so much that I can and cannot do. There is so much that I feel obliged to do. There is so much that I have not been able to sort of come into because I need to conform. And there is so much that I would want to explore about my life and, you know, do and really come into my own, but I wear the hat of the son or daughter of a man or woman of the cloth. And in reading the book, you lived life Gavin's way. You completely lived life Gavin's way. And a lot of people don't get the chance to do that. I mean, obviously the example here is the fact that you were the son of a preacher man, but there are many different contexts where people are not able to get rid of a label that they were born into. And they find it hard, or they don't want to cope with the label or deal with the label of being rebellious or turning against the family or going against tradition or whatever label that they would be given. And how did you do that? How did you, because it can't have come easy. The book is written again in a linear fashion, but there must have been some emotional angst. There must have been some, what are going to be the repercussions of doing this? How does this affect that? You know, I can't. You went drinking when you were 17. The son of a bishop. Why is he drinking? You know, all those things. Yeah. How did you manage?
So I guess in a way once I'd broken with Christianity, I did kind of feel like I was, applying my own furrow kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So that every decision I made from now on was mine. I mean, and I didn't, it was like that I was entirely self-reliant, which is kind of, I mean, from nowadays would seem quite young. I mean, I got no money from my parents, so I had jobs at university, so I could pay for my fees and pay for my living expenses. So I didn't feel tied to that. Now, I mean, maybe that's just the kind of family that I had. And I know, obviously, there are many other different kinds of families where people would feel that intense obligation. but it just didn't. It didn't weigh on me. But I think that in a different way, I have more respect for the church than many other atheists do. I have more respect actually for faith, for religious belief. I'm not evangelical at all in my atheism. I'm very happy when people, if people believe, and I guess in a way that's the carrying over of what I saw in the church, in my family, that there were a lot of positive things that this faith gave them, and so in a way it's like I've gone in the opposite direction from them, but the residues of that have stayed with me.
Gavin, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for the book. And I say that because, as I said earlier, and I've probably said this 2 or 3 times already in our discussion, the points around your experience of your father and the experience of that bond, that trust, that fracture, that rebuilding, that understanding of your mother, that understanding of how your mother's relationship came to be the way that it was, and the rebuilding of that is a conversation that a lot of people do not have. And it's something that people would generally write about in the context of a parenting book or sharing their experience. But you've woven it so nicely into the experience of your life overall. And I think, although the book touches on many, many points, obviously that, there are different takeaways. I think for me in reading the book, that was so profound. And I deeply appreciate that articulation from your part and how eye-opening it is. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much, Nongcebo. I really appreciate it. It was lovely speaking with you.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the podcast. Remember, you can like the episode and share the podcast link, as well as listen to more episodes on the channel. Subscribe to the channel for more. Siyabonga. Thank you for listening.